One of the most common questions I get asked from students is how to practice efficiently and not waste time. So I'm not going to waste any more time on the intro, and let's get right into the video. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this from two different angles. One, as though you've never learned a piece before and this is your very first time learning a piece. And two, how to be efficient if you're practicing a piece, you've already learned it a little bit and you want to get it, performance ready or recording ready. So in order to illustrate this process, I'm going to pick a piece, one that I've never worked on. I'm picking the Chopin Scherzo No. 3 in C sharp minor, opus 39. I've never worked on it, but I've heard it a lot, and that leads me to my first tip. If you are unfamiliar with the piece and you want to learn it, I recommend going and listening to several different recordings by several different artists. That way you can have multiple perspectives in your mind and you'll get a better sense of what the piece should sound like, the harmonies, the structure, etc. Now, approaching a piece for the very first time, some people find it helpful to read all the way through the piece from start to finish just to get a sense for, kind of the difficult spots and to assess what kind of challenges are up ahead. I would say if you are attacking an extremely difficult piece like, Prokofiev Concerto, Rachmaninoff Concerto, Chopin Concerto, it's very long. You might want to skip this process. But some people do find that helpful. I don't always do it. I usually do it when the piece is shorter, and so it's not going to take that much time. If you choose to do this and you've gone through the piece once, this is what you should not do when you practice.
One hour later.
Please don't do this.
Okay, if you practice like this, just reading straight through from start to finish, or even if you take several pages at a time and just go straight from top to bottom, you are wasting your time. It's going to take you much, much longer to learn the piece. So once you go through the piece, isolate the areas that you know are going to be really difficult, and work in bite-sized pieces. Now, as you're looking at the piece for the first time, you notice it's divided into these various sections, which are pretty clear. At the beginning, you have these 4 in the space of 2 notes. That goes on until here. Visually, there's a change, there's a tempo change, then you got these octaves. So I would practice these segments one at a time. Maybe just focusing on this, getting this little unit multiple times, this little unit multiple times, then putting them together. Then I would do kind of the same with the octaves. As you continue to work your way through the piece, make note of the sections that are probably going to be a little bit more difficult. The ones with running passages at really high rates of speed, those are going to take a little bit more work probably. So you'll know that you'll probably need to isolate these a little bit more. Now, once you've isolated the spots that you want to hit, play through a small section multiple times, and each time have it your goal to make it just a little bit better. So what I'm doing right now, it can help to group notes like this. All right, now I'm going to try to get a lighter sound, more leggero. All right, so I'm already noticing that there's a pattern here. Okay, try to get that all the way down now. All right, now I'm gonna do the other hand. Kind of the same process. All right, in the left hand, the pattern that the fingers go through is a little more straightforward than the right hand. It's just a D flat major arpeggio. So I'd probably write that in D flat major arpeggio just to give myself a little bit of visual cue when I come up to that spot and I know what I'm dealing with. Then you can put them together. Now as written. All right, so I've gone through this passage multiple times in multiple different ways. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to get better each time. Then when you come back to it the next day, same process, try to make it a little bit better each time. Now another way to not waste your time is to always practice with a pencil, or if you're on an iPad, make notes in your score. If you're not making any notes in your music, you're probably wasting time. If anyone were to flip through the books that I work on, there would be absolutely no question which pieces I've worked on and which pieces I haven't worked on, because every piece that I work on from the very first day, I'm writing in notes. Usually, the first thing you need to write in is fingering. The more difficult the passage, the more you're going to need to write in the fingering. And writing in the fingering is not just, to figure out what your hands are going to do. It's also to slow down your thinking process enough that when you're thinking about each note individually, it might change the way you approach a passage. So when you're actually going through and you're playing this, it's actually easy to just kind of glance over things, to make mistakes without realizing it, just because you're caught up in the sound of the music and it sounds nice. The chance is that if you're not writing down the fingering, you're probably going to play different fingering each time, which is going to reinforce learning it the wrong way. It's going to take longer for your brain to process all that information. Now, sometimes students will say, well, I don't really know what fingering to do. I'm not sure. I might have a couple things in mind. My advice then, just write down at least something and you can change it later. You see, there are also eraser marks all throughout my music as I decide that maybe I don't like a certain fingering as much as I did the previous day. See, I've erased things there. But it's better to start. It's better to have a plan and then adjust. You see, here's another place where I changed the fingering. So I like to go in with a plan. Otherwise, just looking at a bunch of notes like this, it's kind of overwhelming. It feels like I'm learning it again each time. All right, so let's say that you've worked through a piece, you've already done the basics, you've done the fundamentals, you've gone through it, you know what parts are difficult, you've written down your basic fingerings. Now, what happens to a lot of people is they begin to get stuck at certain points and they can't get over certain issues. So now I'm gonna take you guys through a little bit of what I'm working on right now, some of Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto, and show how I approach a piece that I've already put a lot of work into and I'm wanting to get it up to performance level. Now, especially with longer form works, this piece is very long, it can be tempting to practice too much of it in one day, because you're like, oh, I feel like it's not getting better because I haven't even looked at the first movement in a couple days, or I haven't even really looked at this passage. I spent so much time here. You're gonna have to have a plan of attacking the piece and making sure that you're getting through all the sections, but not trying to do too much in one day, because our brains can only process so much information and you can't really go deep into a passage and really work through the section. So that's one problem, is sometimes people try to play too much of the piece. Just like in the beginning, that can be maybe even more of a temptation later on because you've already put in some of the fundamental work. All right, I'm going to take this passage here. This is a passage that has historically given me a lot of problems. I never truly felt comfortable with it the first time that I played this piece, so I want it to be even better this time. Even though I've already performed this piece in the past and I've already worked on it, I still work hands separately. You might think, oh, I already practiced it hands separately, I don't need to anymore. I would say, especially for more difficult parts, if it's not sounding how you want it, you probably still need to be practicing it hands separately, right and then left. Now, there's a good example of why this is true. I found something the other day, and one of the reasons I was having trouble syncing up my hands was because I was trying to move them in a similar way. So the movement from a chord to a chord the way that Rachmaninoff writes it, he writes a tenuto in a two-note slur to the next note, meaning that the first chord should be heavier than the subsequent chord. A lot of times I don't hear it this way. I hear it the exact opposite, and I think that's because people are trying to go through it too fast, maybe not following what he wrote. But in order to do that, I'm kind of moving in on this chord with a little release on the second chord. Problem was that I was applying that same thing. I was trying to do a similar movement. Now that didn't really work too well when I got to a place like this, because this is right next door. This is really far away. So the right hand has one particular movement pattern. The left hand has a completely different movement pattern. I recommend practicing it as though it were an octave. Because if you're practicing it as though it's an octave, see how your arm automatically has to move into place. Whereas you might do something like this, and your wrist gets kind of wishy-washy, and then you're missing that bottom note. You can be a little more planted if you feel like it's an octave and you're able to shift into that position each time. Now there's another tip I have in relation to speed, and again, this happens later on in learning the piece. Either a person usually practices everything at full speed all the time, or they're practicing it too slow all the time. Practice at a bunch of different speeds, all the way from very slow to possibly even faster than you intend to play it in performance. You want your body and your mind to know this passage as well as you can, sounding in a bunch of different ways. Lastly, I'm going to leave with one extra bonus tip, and this is about something I like to call information density in music. I'm going to cover this topic more in depth on a future video, but just to generalize it, you're going to look at a place that is very dense, and you're going to practice this in a particular way. So this part of the Rachmaninoff Concerto is one of the most dense parts of any piece that I know of, for multiple reasons. One, it's in 30-second notes. One, there's multiple layers. They're in somewhat of a contrapuntal form with the orchestra. There's just a lot happening in a very short period of time. So when that happens, you want to break up the lines individually, not just hands separately, but lines separately. For example, this is actually two different lines. You've got this, and you've got the bottom line. Just practicing this, you might not realize what's happening. And by slowing it down, by breaking it apart, I realize, oh, this is just a chromatic scale. This is just the same thing repeated over 3 times. And then the second half of that, you've got the thumb in the same place, but a chromatic here. And then you can even go further. You can take out the thumb and play the notes in combination without the ostinato thumb. You also realize the shape even more. This is static. These are parallel minor thirds. Okay, that just goes to show there are multiple ways that you can unpack passages. The more difficult they are, the more information dense they are, the more ways you have to unpack them and work on them in small little portions. Anyways, you guys, those are just a few tips and suggestions regarding effective and efficient practicing. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I love to hear what you guys say. Don't forget to subscribe, and in the meantime, stay tuned. I'll see you guys in the next video.